Well, good morning and welcome. Just as it was said, my name's Joe, and I'm an associate pastor at Real Life Ministries in Meridian, and I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm channeling my inner Carlos with my black shirt. Just trying to represent properly, but I'm glad you're here today with us as we continue on our conversation on Sermon on the Mount. Now, I did some research, and I found out y'all started this conversation back in February 28th. You've been here for a minute, haven't you? And that's okay too, because there's so much depth and insight and wisdom for us to know how to be God's people in God's world. And so it's exciting for me to be here and to continue on this journey. We're going to be looking at chapter 7, the beginning of chapter 7, a set of text right in there. And there's 3 chapters in this Sermon on the Mount part of Matthew's Gospel, 5, 6, and 7. So we're approaching the close, right? We're getting close. So maybe in the next 4 months you'll finish off this chapter. I don't know. But before we get there, I'm curious if any of you have had an experience like this, maybe with a friend, a loved one, or a spouse, like in my scenario. And so here's how this went. I've been married for 22 years, and we got married really young and had kids young. And so when my wife turned 21, we were married, and she turned 21, I wanted to do something special for her. I wanted to have a big moment. I wanted to throw a big party for her and surprise her with the party. And so part of the surprise is that you can't let that person know what's happening. And so the whole time leading up to her birthday, I was acting like I'd forgotten, or I was like, oh yeah, and just kind of blowing it off, just kind of being really low key. All the while I was preparing a party for her, a surprise party. And the day of the event, the day of her birthday shows up, and I'm just playing it cool and low key. And my suggestion on her 21st birthday is like, hey, let's go to the Warhawk Museum. Right? I'm trying to throw her off the scent. So there we are on her 21st birthday in the middle of July. Her birthday's next week. And a hot, just muggy July at the Warhawk Museum with my parents, mind you, and our infant newborn, lugging that little baby around. It was an experience, right? I had gone so far the other direction that by the time we got back to the house, I had ruined the experience altogether. And it was hard for her to get in the moment because of the amount of work I did to actually take her out of the moment. I've learned since then that the thing that I thought was important doesn't always transfer to the person I love or care about and what they need. And with that in mind, I have a question for you. At Eastwind, we like to wrestle with questions at the beginning of the service to help us onboard what's about to be taught. And so here is the question I have for you this morning. The question is, has there ever been a time in your life when someone tried to help you or do something nice for you, but instead of being helpful, they actually made things worse? And for the next minute or two, I just want you to talk about that amongst each other and reflect on a time maybe where that happened. Go ahead, and I'll come back here in a second. Take a moment to talk about that. I'll give you about 15 more seconds. All right. Oh, sorry, I went back too far. I'm just going to put it on that Sermon on the Mount slide. There we go. that question is actually going to come back to us towards the end. So I want you to stay with me for a little bit as we get into this conversation. Now, before we launch into the verses that we're going to cover, I want to do a bit of world building for you. We need to set the stage, and I think this is really important for us to do when we're reading the text to try to understand what's happening around this set of verses that I'm reading in front of me. Where did it come from? How did we get it? Why was it written down? Why has it been shared? Why has it been preserved? What does it mean for us to understand the nuance of what we're reading? We need to set the stage a little bit, and so part of my upbringing, part of my studies as an adult, I've been studying textual criticism, how we got the Bible is a big part of my life. I've been teaching that for years. And so I can't, we got to put our nerd hat on for a minute, right? We got to put our thinking cap on. And so I'm going to ask you to stay with me because for some of you, we're going to get a little deep, we're going to get a little nerdy, but I promise you the payoff is going to be huge. And so stay with me for a minute as we unpack what is the Sermon on the Mount. We're all familiar with it. I mean, if you've been in Christianity for any number of years, even if you haven't, you're familiar with these sets of teachings. And the question that I like to ask when I'm reading the Bible is, how did we get this? Because most of the time when we're reading the Sermon on the Mount, we picture things in our head. When we're reading the Bible, we like to do like word pictures. And so as the text kind of says, as Jesus went up on the mountain, he began to teach. And so we're picturing Jesus on a mountain and there's a group of people around and then he just begins to give this sermon, much like what I'm doing right here to you in a room like this where he's preaching a sermon and all the people hear it and then they go, oh, that's great. And then they end with a closing song, and then they go out and they greet each other, right? No. That's most likely actually what didn't happen, at least the way Matthew records it. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying that Jesus didn't preach sermons or that there were large crowds of people that came around. What I'm saying is that what Matthew is giving us in chapters 5, 6, and 7 are very intentional. He has arranged them for a reason. It's not like he was just sitting on the hill trying to keep up with everything that Jesus said, okay? 30 to 40 years later, after the resurrection of Jesus, he is out and he is recalling back the things that Jesus had taught. And he's writing these things down and arranging them in certain particular ways. And it's important to understand, most all scholars believe that this set of teachings are just an arrangement that Matthew took of all the things that Jesus said. Jesus would have gone from town to town and place to place, and he would have been in large groups, small groups, and he would have been preaching the kingdom of God. That's what he said he came to do. And what does it look like to be a part of this kingdom? This is the teachings that we have here. And so if Matthew is up to something, the question then becomes, how do we know that he's up to something? How do we know that there's something going on here with Matthew's writing of 5, 6, and 7? And the clues are a little bit in the details. And so we're going to get a little bit into the details and look at some of the clues so that we can understand maybe what he's trying to get us to hear this morning. And so the first clue is this, Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 says this, when he saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And we go, okay, we can picture that. He saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. That's interesting. Because when you compare that to Luke's version of this story, you actually get a different beginning. Luke starts a very similar Sermon on the Mount-esque story, very truncated. In Luke chapter 6, you get this reduced version of what Matthew gives in 5, 6, and 7, this reduced version. And the way that Luke starts this story is very different than Matthew. Luke says this, then he came down with them and stood on a level place. Or in the Greek there, that could be plain. He stood on a plain, a level, open plain. Okay, so we go, which is it? Right? Did he go up to a mountain or did he go down to a plain? And some can argue that maybe it was both. Maybe these are two different instances being recorded. I actually think that's the clue in and of itself. And to understand that clue, we got to talk about mountains. Okay, so we're going to talk about mountains for a second. This is a picture of Mount Bora. At least I believe the internet is telling me that this is a picture of Mount Bora, okay? I've never climbed it. Has anybody ever climbed Mount Bora? Look at, yes, let's go. Look at y'all. I won't be doing that. I'm what they call indoorsy, okay? So, but I'm mad respect. I have mad respect. I have two of my friends here this morning hanging out with us, come to hear me. They're like super outdoorsy and do all sorts of stuff. Not me. So Mount Bora, though, I heard is beautiful. I heard it's amazing. It's a mountain, and this mountain actually sits at an elevation of 12,662 feet. Now, that's not going to win any awards for sizes of mountains, okay? But for Idaho, that's pretty good, right? I think it's the largest mountain in Idaho, maybe. I don't know, I'm getting some nods. Yes, thank you very much. So yeah, it's not like huge, it's not Everest, but it's still pretty big, right? Compare that to a mountain range that we see every day. This is Bogus Basin, right? We know this view. We see it all the time. Driving to work, coming home, you go hiking up in the foothills of it. You ski. Any skiers? Bogus Basin skiers? Again, not me. But I believe it's awesome, and I trust you that it's really good. But that basin up there is 7,582 feet of elevation, okay? So not quite Bora, but also significant, right? We can see it. We see the snow. It's there. It's present. It's right in our view. I grew up in Salt Lake City, and we were surrounded by beautiful mountains all the time. Mountains, giant mountains. When you compare that to the region where Jesus had done his ministry, the geography of where he would have been preaching and teaching and visiting places. This is called the Judean Hills. And this is a picture of it. The Judean Hills. This hillside, these ranges actually go from 1,600 feet to 3,200 feet in elevation. Not quite mountains. Not quite mountains. In fact, the highest mountain range that would have been closest to Jesus would have been Mount Hermon. That sits at 9,200 feet. But that would have been 33 miles away from the Sea of Galilee. Not quite, this walking distance to get up a mountain, right? So what's happening? It's as if Luke's account is actually more accurate, that he went down into a place. So in the Judean hillside, you have nestled in it Jerusalem. And Jerusalem sits roughly around 2,400 feet in elevation. And so as Luke says that he went down to a level plain, he could have been going down from an elevation of 2,400 to maybe an elevation of 1,700 feet. Not quite the mountain that we're picturing, like hillsides, right? Rolling hills more than mountains. So why does Matthew say he went on a mountain? Okay? So in the Greek, you have this word mountain. It's horos. Horos is the word for mountain. There's a word for plain. There's a word for level field. It's not horos. Horos is a mountain. And for those who grew up at the time of Jesus in the 1st century, 2nd century, and on, the Hebrew Bible that they would have read in synagogue, anywhere in the diaspora, they would have read in synagogue a version of the Hebrew Bible not written in Hebrew. They would have written what's known as they would have read what's known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that originated during the time of Alexander when he was conquering the known world, and he was what's called Hellenizing the known world, making everyone Greek and speaking Greek. And so what had happened is that Israel began to translate their Hebrew scriptures into Greek because that's what everyone was speaking. Even at the time of Jesus, they didn't speak Hebrew. He spoke Aramaic, which was a cousin language of Hebrew, because the Hebrew language was dying off at the time of Jesus. So they needed Greek versions of the Bible so that they could participate in reading Torah. And this is what they would have read. So Jesus would have grown up reading a Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. The disciples would have grown up reading a Greek version, the Septuagint, of the Hebrew Bible. And when they were writing their texts, they still would have been using the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And when you come to a significant moment in the Hebrew Bible about mountains, about someone going on a mountain, about someone receiving law instruction to pass down to everyone that is at the base of the mountain, to learn what it means to be the people of God, where do our minds go? Moses, Sinai. And in Exodus chapter 24, it says this. So Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered it. And it's the same exact Greek word that Matthew uses, horos. It's as if Matthew's trying to get this audience that's reading this text to see that Jesus is the new Moses. That he's mapping on the story of Moses onto what Jesus is up to. So when we read these texts, this Sermon on the Mount, our imagination should go to what Moses had done for these slaves who were brought into freedom. They were brought to this mountainside. Moses goes up on the mountain and comes down and delivers to them the new law, this covenant law for them to follow. Why? So that they can be, in fact, the image-bearing creations that they were always meant to be, that they were to image the Creator to the world. And this is how you do it. This is how you do it. That's where Torah came from. This is how you be those people. And it's as if Matthew's saying, this is what Jesus is doing. That when he delivers these teachings, these sayings are how we actually be kingdom people. Which means something very significant. That these passages that we read aren't suggestions. They aren't things that we just go, oh, like that's, okay, yeah, maybe I shouldn't look at a woman lustfully because that's really tough. I don't know. No. These aren't suggestions. This is a new covenant. When we're asking the question of what does it look like for me to faithfully follow Jesus in our world, the Sermon on the Map is the blueprint. It's the instruction. Jesus is acting and modeling out as the new Moses and how giving us the information of what does it mean to be God's people in his kingdom. How do we live this out? So we've got to take this serious. We can't just be passive about these teachings. All these things that have led up to where we're at today, all the previous teachings since February is led us to this place where we have to reflect on, am I that person? Am I doing this? Am I the kind of person that's living this out? And that's where we find ourselves today as we reflect on a set of teachings from Jesus that are very popular from Christian and non-Christian. We hear this a lot. In fact, we hear this the most when we feel like someone is judging us. And we say things like this: don't judge me. Why? Well, Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it, it will be measured to you. Don't judge. You shouldn't judge me. Don't judge me. Okay, what is Jesus doing here? Okay, what is Jesus doing? Because it's pretty straightforward. And so when we think about this and we just put our thinking caps on, does Jesus mean that there is no place for anyone to do any kind of judging ever? Unequivocally, no. Like judgment is a part of life. In fact, there's plenty of places where we are encouraged to actually hold each other accountable and share with each other. And so judging is a part of life. And I think what happens is that we often think of judging only in negative terms, as if it's only a bad word. Judging is just an action. It's a thing we do. We can judge for good reasons. We can judge for bad reasons. We can judge for indifferent reasons. Judging is the thing that we do. It's how we go about our judging that Jesus is concerned with. I believe that Jesus is referring to the judgments and condemnations that occur in ordinary lives as people set themselves up as moral guardians and critics of one another. He's addressing the kinds of people that set themselves up and above others as a moral guardian of I got to tell you what's right, this is the right way, and I'm that person to declare that. He begins to hone in on this kind of judgment, which was common in his day. he went around challenging the Pharisees who lived in such a way where they were trying to get Israel to be faithful Torah observers. That's not a bad judgment. And sometimes we give the Pharisees a bad rap, like they're just like these evil people running around. Not all the case. Their hearts, they had a desire to get Israel back to faithful Torah observance because they believed that in doing so, that would usher in the Messiah. And so they were trying to do the right thing, but executing it in the wrong way because they were creating a climate of like moral judgment where people were backstabbing each other and neighbors were telling on other neighbors about things that they're doing wrong and getting them in trouble. And it created a negative context. And I ask and I wonder, have you ever felt judged in this way? Usually from a fellow believer of Jesus, where you were made to feel less than because of something you think, believe, or act. Now, Jesus doesn't mean that we shouldn't have high standards of behavior for ourselves and our world. That's not what he's saying. But that the temptation to look down on each other for moral failures is itself a temptation to play God. Think of it maybe like this. Just because we are children of God doesn't give us the positional authority to play the role of fathers in others' lives. What do we mean by that? If you have kids and siblings or a brother and sister, have you ever heard this? Like, the younger is trying to parent the older one or the older one's trying to parent the younger one, and then you hear things like you're not my mom, you're not my dad. Like that happens, right? It's this belief system that we have a higher positional authority to actually then parent someone else in what they're doing. Now, let's pause and remember, Jesus isn't addressing the role of accountability or correction that people play in our lives, okay? We got to be able to balance these two ideas in the same hand that he's not talking about universal judgment. We should never judge because clearly there are times that we should play a role of correction and support and love for one another, but also that we shouldn't be setting ourselves up above someone else, casting down judgments on them. And Jesus helped us understand this problem in the next set of verses. Verse 3, it says this: "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Now, oftentimes when we read this, I imagine in our heads we're reading this with a negative tone. Like there's a tone to it don't judge the speck and, take the plank out of your own eye. And it says negative. I actually wondered, though, if this is actually meant to be humorous. As if Jesus has a little smirk on his face when he's saying this because it's ridiculous. The audience would have heard this the speck in your eye, but you have like a telephone pole in your face. And it's almost like, yeah, exactly. I think that's how the audience would have heard it. They almost would have chuckled how ridiculous that is, how silly it is to picture this idea of having this plank in your own eye. But I think what's important here is what Jesus is drawing on is the observation of how do we make judgments. What is the root of a judgment? The root of a judgment is an observation about something. And how do we make that observation? With our eye. With our eye. I love how Tim Mackey from the Bible Project makes this point. He says this: when we try to decide to judge a brother or sister, we observe a behavior that we think is destructive or maybe goes against Jesus' teachings. He says the first thing Jesus wants us to assume is that our vision is impaired. There's a plank in our eye. When we are making judgments, whether right or wrong, again, the judgment, there's no good, bad. When we're making judgments, assume that your vision is impaired. Assume you don't have the whole story. assume you don't know their motives. Assume you don't know the whole complex inner working of that person. Assume you can't see clearly. That doesn't mean that their behavior is right. It can still be wrong, right? There is a speck of dust. That wasn't figurative. It's like there might be something there. But remember, you have a telephone pole in your face, and you may not be able to see the whole picture. Do you see it? How silly this is. If we were to be the people of God, we need to act toward each other in a way that reflects this reality when we're making judgments. First, we must address our own sins. And second, we acknowledge that our vision may be impaired. And when we take these two things in consideration when we're making judgments, that one, I've got some issues I got to work out. I'm real quick here to say this thing, but I need to self-reflect first. And I also need to assume maybe I don't know the whole story, that I can't see clearly. When we can act in this way, it will allow us to walk in love and kindness towards those we desire God's best. Then we work into verse 6. And verse 6 feels like a little out of left field. Verse 6 is like, what? Because we just got done, like, don't judge. And we're like, okay. And then he's like, hey, you got a speck and a plank in your eye. And so just be mindful of it. And it feels like that's a good conclusion. Like, it feels like it could end there. And then verse 6. And it's like, what are you doing with this? This is the verse. You've heard it before, I'm sure. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. And we all go, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. What's happening here? Now, scholars have debated this passage for centuries, and I don't presume to say that my interpretation here is the premium interpretation. I think I'm pretty close. But what I think here is how we read this is important. Again, how we read this is important. Most people read this passage like an allegory, meaning we're trying to understand, like, what's the pearl? Is the pearl the kingdom of God? Is the pearl me? Is the pearl believers? What are the dogs and pigs? Are those Gentiles? Is that the outside world? Is that the bad thing? And we're using this teaching like an allegory when it's probably more a parable, which fits more in line with Jesus' teaching method, right? Parables. And the point of a parable is that you actually are trying to get to the root understanding of the story that's being presented. What is the point of the story? And when we read this verse as a parable, we actually might see something that Jesus is trying to get us to understand, which is he's driving home this idea that we should be the kinds of people that are mindful of what we offer others. What do I mean by that? What use does a dog or a pig have with a pearl? Any? Would a pearl or a dog or a pig use a pearl for any reason? No, it actually doesn't make sense, which I think is another silly example that Jesus is doing. I think he's making the crowd laugh. Because imagine, like, you have this pearl and you're like, oh, I love this pearl. This is the best pearl. And you see a bunch of dogs and pigs and you're like, yeah, here you go, guys. Like, no. Like, it's silly. Yes, you're laughing because that's what Jesus is invoking here. He's going, that's silly. You wouldn't give a dog or a pig a pearl because that's not what they need. What do they need? And that's the heart of this portion right here is what's your motivation? Are you more concerned of giving people what you think is valuable, thus imposing that on them? And you go, but Joe, the value is the kingdom of God. The value is Jesus. And I go, yeah, it is. It's a beautiful thing. Is that what they need? Is that what they need? Maybe instead of judgment, they need a friend. Maybe instead of judgment, they need some food. Maybe instead of judgment, they need some prayer. Maybe instead of judgment, they need someone to listen. And maybe instead of your judgment, they need fill in the blank. Are you more concerned of throwing your valuable pearl to them than what they actually need? Because when we start there, then maybe, when we help them with what they need, they'll be ready to take what we want to give and receive what's at the heart of the gospel. You see it. This silly little statement, this silly little parable is trying to get at us to understand the silliness that we think we have when we're just giving what we think they need. Much like what I did with my wife on her 21st birthday. She needs this great big party. I learned my wife doesn't like surprise parties. And I learned that day, okay? What I thought she needed wasn't what she needed. And we do this all the time with our judgments. Well, this is what they need. Maybe they don't right now. Maybe they don't right now. And so with this in mind, I want to leave you with some thoughts, some things to wrestle with as you go about this week. Go back to your jobs, go back to your communities, some things to take home with you today. And these take-homes actually come out of the letter James in your New Testament. James, the half-brother of Jesus. Most scholars believe that what James was writing, he was actually writing wisdom literature through the lens of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. That if you take the letter James, you can actually extrapolate out Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Where he's saying, if this is the wisdom of how to actually live it out as kingdom people. It's this beautiful study that you can do, James and Sermon on the Mount, and you'll see these connections that he's making. And one of the connections he makes in regards to judgment is in chapter 1, verse 19. It goes like this. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So the question, does this reflect your attitude and posture towards others you have concern for? Now, do you see the three-part rhythm there? This has Matthew 7 all throughout it. This quick to listen. Everyone should be quick to listen. What does that mean? I'm assuming that I don't know everything. I'm assuming that I don't understand their motivation. So what should I do? I should listen. Before I'm out there pouncing, I should take a posture of humility and just listen and understand, right? Then he's slow to speak, which is a reflection of our ability to go, before I actually say the thing that's in my mind, maybe I should reflect on my own shortcomings. Before I'm someone that's so quick to put someone on blast for something, I should be aware and repentive of my own sin first. I should be slow to speak because I don't want to be that person that just puts it out there and is not mindful of my own shortcomings. And then he says, and slow to become angry. Slow to become angry. This idea that sometimes when we offer what we think people need before understanding what they actually need, we get mad at them, right? Because they're like, they're not taking it. They're just reject. There's so, all these things, and we get mad at the other because they didn't take what we thought they needed instead of finding out what they need first and offering that. We were more concerned with what we think they need. And listen, if there's any more convicting message we need to hear in our culture and our climate today, it's that we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. With each other. So I want you to reflect. Is this your attitude and posture towards others you have concern for? The second thing comes out of chapter 2, verse 13. He says this, judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So how can you take the time this week and offer mercy to those you tend to judge? How might you engage with humility rather than judge with hostility? What does that look like for you this week with the judgments you are making? Mercy triumphs over judgment. So as I leave you with these thoughts and these take-homes, I'm going to give you a few minutes to just sit, ponder, reflect, talk to Jesus about the ways in which you need to make adjustments in your life. Because remember, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, are not suggestions. This is the new way God's people ought to live and act towards each other and others. So let's take a moment and reflect on these thoughts this morning.